Video, I am going to show you how to isolate layers using Photoshop and the new Generative Fill feature inside of Photoshop. Isolating layers is really important because when you think about the way a camera operates, so to create movement, you need to create parallax, which basically means that elements in the foreground move faster than elements in the background. The best example of this would be if you were driving in a car parallel to a mountain, the mountain in the background would feel like it's not moving at all, but you know, all the stop signs and stuff in the foreground, they would be whipping by really fast. And so really the speed of the movement depends on how close to the camera the objects are. And that's really important whenever you start doing shots, like if we were to push in on this shot, these rocks would move out of the way faster than, for example, the midground here. So it's really important to be able to separate these layers for doing cinematic work, especially if you're taking MidJourney images and wanting to animate them. So I'm going to show you the full workflow. We're going to use this shot here. The shot is actually a little complex, but I think that if you could do this shot, you really can do any shot inside of Photoshop. So let's get started here. I'm going to start by up-resing our image because this is a MidJourney image, and we'll go to gigapixel. So let's just drag and drop our example image here. In your project files, you'll have a full res image, and I'll just set it to be 5,000 pixels, and I'll turn down the noise and the compression. We'll just do a standard up-res, no other features here. And we'll save this image. And isolated image up-res. Click save. So this whole process taking about 6 seconds, right? So now we'll hop over to Photoshop and import our image. So Command O to open, and then we will select our image here. So the up-res version of the image. Nice. And high quality. You can see that the up-res did a really good job. Has like retained all of the information with like the fuzziness of the rocks and stuff like that. Okay, cool. So whenever we are isolating layers, it's really important to think about what are the separate layers that you want to remove, and to work backwards from your desired result. And so, for example, in this image, we have the sky. We have this like background layer with these like mountains and like whatever this field of like black rocks is. We then have a foreground layer where we have this kind of brown dirt here with the woman. And then we have the hyper foreground layer where we have these out of focus rocks. So I've actually found that it works a little bit better to work from back to front rather than from front to back. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to duplicate our background layer. And if the lock is on, you could hold down Option to deselect the lock to where you have control of that. And we're going to name this one background. And what we're going to do, we're going to use the lasso tool here. And we want to essentially just select everything that is not the sky background. In fact, that might be a better name, sky background. And we'll just go ahead and select everything that is not the bright sky here. And then go down here. Just like that. And you guessed it, we'll use Generative Fill just to remove the background in Generate. Okay, cool. So it's so funny that it added in this fake scene. It doesn't really matter because we really just need the top part here. But if we wanted to, we could hypothetically just go in and, you know, completely just this like random photo of like, I don't know, like the Amazon River or whatever. It actually looks pretty good. That's so funny. But really we don't need it because we just need just this top part removed as the background. So that's good. I'm going to add this to the very bottom. We'll just keep that live there, and we'll call this the sky background. Cool. So it's just living on its own back there in the back. And then what I would recommend is combining the sky background and the background layer. Hit Command E to combine them together, and then just move them to the back. So now we have our background image behind our original image. Cool. So now what we want to do is remove the next layer. So the next layer is I want to have this like rock background with these cliffs and then these like mountains back here, but I want to remove all of this foreground element and then this foreground layer because we're working basically with 4 layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select just this part here. Just roughly cut out everything. Doesn't have to be perfect. Generative Fill is very, very forgiving. Just go down here, and we will generate it right out of the scene. Okay, great. I mean, that did a really good job. If I toggle it on and off, I mean, it really does seem very natural for the scene. And yeah, it's kind of what you would expect. It did a really great job. Like, look how in focus this is. Like, it like estimated what these rocks would look like. I mean, every time I use this tool, I'm just blown away. So again, I'm going to duplicate. So this is let me rename it, our original layer here. So we turn off eyes. So this is our original layer, the original scene. And I'm going to duplicate that by hitting Command J. So we have our original layer. We can just keep it as a copy there. And let's turn on the eye for the generative fill layer. And I'm going to select the generative fill layer, the original scene, hit Command E to combine them together. So now we have a singular image here on and off that has this third level, because we have foreground, the hyper foreground, midground layer, which is this third layer, and then the background. So now what we need to do is actually remove the sky from this third layer, because if you think about it, we have our background, which is going to be layer 4. We have our midground, which is layer 3, and we want the sky, to reveal layer number 4 in the background. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do, there's quite a few tools that you can use inside of Photoshop. The quick selection tool is one of my favorite. So the way it works is, it's over here on the right. You can just select quick selection tool, and you just paint over the areas that you want to very, very quickly select. So in this instance, we want to select essentially just the sky. So I'm just going to start painting, and you can see it begins to estimate what I want to grab here. And as I painted further, you see it actually started grabbing the ground that I don't want. And that's no problem at all. What you can do is hold down Option and repaint over the areas that you want. So I'm going to hold down Option and repaint to introduce those back into our selection. Just like this. You can see that we're selecting, there's these slight mountains here. I want them to be part of the midground, so I'm going to deselect those. And then we'll go back here. I'm holding down Option as I'm dragging, just selecting those layers there. Cool. So now we have more or less a rough selection of the sky. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit Command, Shift, and I. And that basically inverted our selection to where now the ground is selected. So it's not the sky that's selected anymore, it's the ground and then the mountains and everything else. Well, now what we need to do is go in and do a little more refinement. So I'm going to make sure I have my quick selection mask selected, and then it will change the menu up here at the top. And let's click Select and Mask. So now if I look in here, you can make sure that the opacity is turned up to 50% here. This red basically just telling you everything that you don't have selected in your scene. So let's go in and just make sure that we are getting the edge correctly here. So by default, it is detecting the edges. And what I really want you to do is go in here and mess around with some of these features. Now, there's a really cool feature up here in the top right. So there is the quick selection tool. So if we needed to introduce anything else, we totally could. And then there's a refine edge feature that works really good for hair. And a brush tool that, for example, if we wanted to simply brush in certain parts, like let's say there's this part right here with this this mountain peak we want to add back in, we could do that. But generally, I think it did a pretty good job. Now, you can see in the edges here, there's a little bit of bleeding to where the sky is bleeding over onto the mountain. And what we can do to fix that is set up a refinement. So we can shift the edge, basically. We can shift it in or shift it out. I'm going to shift it in this instance. And typically, whenever you have a layer, it's not going to have a harsh pixel edge like this. You typically want to feather it. So you can turn up the feathering just a little bit, just so the edge feels more natural. And over here with this mountain, especially because it's a little bit more in the foreground, I think I want to clean up the edges here. There's many different ways that you could do this. I think the easiest would just be to use a brush. And a brush is pretty cool. So if you hold down Control and Option and drag to the left and right, you can adjust the brush size. And if you hold down Control and Option and go up and down, you adjust the brush's hardness. So I almost always like using a more soft brush as opposed to a brush that is more hard, because edges naturally tend to be a little softer. So I'm going to hold down Option and paint out these light edges here. So let's go ahead and paint out those edges just so it looks a little more natural. And if you go too far in, like for example here, I can just deselect Option and then paint it back in, just like that. This is a process called rotoscoping. It's actually widely regarded as one of the most tedious tasks in the world of filmmaking, especially like when you have to do this in like actual moving footage and going from shot to shot. It is a pain to rotoscope. So definitely something that you don't want to have to do long term. But for just like quickly like fixing a scene, it's a pretty helpful process here. Cool. I think this is looking pretty darn good. So let me go ahead and zoom out here. Cool. So you can see the edge looks pretty good, and we have a bit of a fuzzy edge. I'm going to feather it out just a little bit more. About like that. Out there. Get a little bit more, just slight. No. Cool. And even we can turn up the smoothing just a little bit. Smoothing out that edge. Go. Turn it down just a little. Great. So now we have this foreground selected, and we want to output to a new layer. So just output to a new layer there. And now, if I turn off everything, you can see this checkerboard pattern basically means that part is transparent. So we have this new layer. It's the midground layer 3. I'm going to move it on top of layer 4, and I'll delete our layer 3. So now you can see if we turn off the foreground layer and the background layer, it feels like one cohesive image, but it's actually a layer with a transparent background with an image behind it. Okay, cool. So now let's get the next layer taken care of. So again, we're going to start by going to the lasso tool, and let's duplicate that original layer. I'm going to call this the foreground layer. And we'll say layer 2. So we just keep everything organized. It's really good to just name everything and keep it organized as you're working through this process. So we're going to remove these rocks here. So I'm going to select the rocks just like this. Like super rough about it. It doesn't have to be fancy. Down here, that generative fill and generate. So we'll give this a few seconds to remove those rocks. Okay, cool. So, I mean, it did a pretty good job. We turned this on and off. You can see the foreground layer is, the hyper foreground layer is removed. Okay, so again, we're going to duplicate our original, move it under this new generative fill layer, and I'm going to select both, hit Command E, and now we have, if I turn off all of our other layers, a single layer that has the hyper foreground removed. So again, just like before we removed the sky, now it's time to remove everything in layer number 3. So I'm going to zoom in here, and let's select our quick selection tool. There are also other tools that you can select, like for example, the object selection tool. It works sometimes. It's better for like selecting actual objects like people or like this rock or whatever. But whenever you have a little bit more of like an abstract background, I don't find that it works as well. So, you know, I recommend messing around with it, but really quick selection I think is the most helpful for just like quick projects like this. So I'm going to go ahead and select our background just really roughly here, and hold down Option to reintroduce certain parts that we want in that second layer. It's a little tricky because the dirt here is it's kind of the same color, but we can just kind of back and forth. I'm holding down Option, you know, to introduce certain elements, holding down, not selecting Option to introduce other elements. It's just a back and forth process. Like for example, like this layer here, I want to be in the foreground layer, so I'm pull down Option and introduce it here. Just a back and forth process. You can get as tedious and as detailed as you want. You know, the more professional the project needs to be, the more, you know, detailed you can be in your selections here. So now we have the top part selected here. Again, I'm going to hit Command-Shift-I to invert the mask, and then we will hit the Select and Mask tool. So now we have our foreground selected. And let's go in here and start cleaning up. So go over here to the edge, and again, we can use quick selection to just quickly paint in the parts that we want. Hold down Option to remove the parts we don't. Just like that. And I don't know if Quick Selection Mask uses AI, but it feels very knowledgeable about how edges work. So I definitely recommend using it to do tasks like this. And then when you need to step in and really refine some stuff, you can use the brush tool to go in and do it by hand. But using the more advanced tools I find to be helpful during this process. So those parts look pretty good. That part right there is not quite right. I like that. It looks good. This isn't quite right here. It's a back and forth process. So as you can see, it's really just using your own creative imagination. You're going to have your finger above that option key constantly as you're just workshopping stuff in, taking it out, back and forth. That's fine. Our close here, we'll add back in, hold down option to remove. Again, just a back and forth process here. Great. And we'll come back to her hair. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Let's finish out the scene, these foreground elements. I think that's part of the foreground there. Exciting tutorial, rotoscoping, my goodness. Okay. Cool. So now we have a pretty good selection of the rock part of the foreground elements. Now let's go over here to our subject and let's get into some nitty-gritty stuff here. So hair is always a problem because hair is very wispy and it's hard to fully direct the tool using the quick selection feature to give you exactly like really good hair. So what I'm going to first do is I'm just going to like quick selection, get some of this hair detail back in here, and I'll deselect this part where you can kind of see through the hair. Just like that, where we have just kind of a rough breakdown of what we want here. So now let's go in and select our hair. So we can use this a refine edge brush. It's really designed specifically for hair, and it's really smart. You could just begin to paint over any parts that have hair and deselect, and you can see, especially if I zoom in here, now the hair is selected, but you'd see the red peeking through, and if I turn this up to like really exaggerate, you can see the red is beginning to peek through. So it looks really good. And I'm going to do the same thing for this hair here. And just drag her along the edge of her head here. You can see that this part is fully her scalp, but it actually introduced some of the background. So that's not quite right. So I'll definitely want to use the selection mask to reintroduce her head. She should not have her head be see-through in those parts. And then down here, again, we can refine all of this, just make your brush big, and then go in and refine, and it's going to do its AI thing to think about the way that this is supposed to look here. That's just a really, really great job. Cool. Okay, cool. Oop. Okay, cool. So we have a good selection now. Oop. We get this part here. That part and that part there. Great. Okay, so now we have all of our foregrounds selected here. And I'm going to make sure that it's creating a new layer for us, and we'll hit OK. So we have the foreground layer selected. And if we wanted to, just, in hindsight, we could fuzzy up the edges a bit. They are a little fuzzy already, so I think they'll work for our scene, but you could feather those out if you wanted to. I'm going to call this layer 2, or actually foreground layer 2. Click away, and we'll drag this below here. And we have all three layers. So we have background layer, midground, foreground, and then finally we need to remove the rocks. So let's very quickly delete these rocks. I'm just going to select each layer here, and we will delete it from our scene. And we have our original layer, and it's a good form to just always just duplicate your original layer and not edit the original. I'll just move to the very bottom. And all we need to do now is just select our foreground. So we don't need to go in and like do generative fill for anything. So I'll use our quick selection tool to select these rocks. Hold down option to really quickly paint. Again, I just want to show you how quick you can be with this. Quick. Did a pretty good job. Looks pretty good. paint it in, paint it out. Option. Great. And then we will go to select and mask. We'll shift the edge just a little bit because I think we want to shift it in and then feather it out because it's an out of focus foreground layer. And yeah, maybe I'll turn up the edge shift even more there. Push it in just a little bit more. Turn up the feathering because it's a depth of field shot. We can turn up the feathering just a little bit more. Not like that. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer, hit OK. And now we have, I'm going to say the hyper foreground layer 1. And now if we put everything together, we have our hyper foreground layer, our foreground, midground, and then background. So all these together are now making up what looks like our original image. So this is the original. This is everything edited. Obviously, there's a few changes with like the background and things like that, but really the changes are super minimal. It's really at its core the exact same scene. So again, if you wanted to, like for example, in hindsight, like maybe I would go in and like feather this edge a little bit more. You totally have the freedom to get as detailed as you want. So when you're ready to save, go to File and Save As, and then you can save this as a Photoshop file so you have the individual layers. And these files can then be taken into a tool like After Effects to animate, which we will get to very soon.